On the night between September 18th and 19th India time, the Canadian Prime Minister stood up in his parliament and made a public statement saying that Canada is actively pursuing credible allegations linking the Indian government agents to the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who is a Canadian citizen and a Sikh separatist leader in British Columbia. In June, he was gunned down. Now, 45-year-old Hardeep Singh Nijjar was shot dead outside a Sikh temple on the 18th of June in Surrey, a Vancouver suburb with a large Sikh population. He supported the call for Khalistan, a Sikh homeland or an independent state independent from India, and was designated as a terrorist in India and wanted for many crimes. Now, since that statement was made by Justin Trudeau in his parliament, things have escalated. Like I said, both countries have expelled each other's diplomats. An advisory was issued by India urging Indian nationals in Canada, especially students, to exercise what was called utmost caution. And this is what our foreign ministry said, and I'm quoting, in view of growing anti-India activities, politically condoned hate crimes and criminal violence in Canada, all Indian nationals there and those contemplating to travel are urged to exercise utmost caution. On the 21st of September, India suspended its visa services in Canada until further notice, which means that all visas for Canadian citizens traveling to India have now been put on hold. The announcement was made via the BLS Indian Application Center, citing the Indian mission notice. After that, we've had a press conference addressed by the Ministry of External Affairs of India, saying that they have asked the High Commission of Canada to downsize the number of its diplomats that it has here in order to make it the same size as the Indian mission that's currently in Canada. Now, Canada is part of several alliances of Western countries. It's part of NATO, it's part of G7. It is also part of an alliance called the Five Eyes Alliance, which includes US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. These countries share intelligence ops. Now, we understand from reports that are coming in that Justin Trudeau has reached out to his allies, especially the Five Eyes, repeatedly asking for their support on this matter. Now, from the statements that we have received publicly from these countries, it does seem like the countries have made sort of similar sounding statements where they have supported an investigation, but not necessarily condemned India in any way. The United States has said it's deeply concerned over Canada's accusations, but it's also said that those who are responsible must be held accountable, and we hope traditional friends and partners will cooperate in getting to the bottom of it. Australian Prime Minister did not mention India in his comment. The Australian Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, told a press conference that these are concerning reports, and I note that investigations are still underway. We are monitoring those developments closely, and we will continue to do so. How did the UK react? The United Kingdom has made no official announcement, but its Foreign Secretary James Cleverly had put out a tweet on X. He said all countries should respect the sovereignty and the rule of law. We're in regular contact with our Canadian partners about the serious allegations raised in the Canadian Parliament. Now, we understand that a lot of this began during the G20 when Justin Trudeau visited New Delhi. At that point, we saw photographs of the two leaders, of India's Prime Minister Modi and Justin Trudeau, in a handshake that seemed awkward and cold. We also understand from reports that Prime Minister Modi's team did not hand over an appointment to Justin Trudeau for a one-on-one conversation. Justin Trudeau also skipped a dinner that was hosted by the Indian president for the G20 delegates. Now, we must know a couple of things, that there are 1.4 million ethnic Indian people living in Canada right now, out of which a little over 3 lakh of them are students who are currently Indian students in universities. How will all of this affect them, and what's going to happen going forward? To help us answer all of these questions, Suhasini Haider, who is the diplomatic affairs editor at the Hindu newspaper, joins me right now. She's been tracking external affairs for a very long time, so couldn't have asked for a better voice to help us understand all of this. Ms. Haider, thank you so much for speaking with us. My first question to you is this. I just talked about the number of Indian students who are currently studying in universities in Canada. We have our Ministry of External Affairs putting out an advisory. The question is, will our Indian students be safe? Does this change life for them in any way?
Well, certainly it is a question of concern, although the Ministry of External Affairs has made it clear this is the responsibility of the Canadian government to ensure that Indians in Canada are safe. I think there's more than 1 million actually people of Indian origin or Indians in Canada now. And, I don't know the exact figures, but tens of thousands of Indian students go to Canada every year. It's one of the major destinations for Indian students. Are they safe right now? Certainly, as diplomatic tensions rise. And these are not just diplomatic tensions between two governments. These have gotten very involved in the domestic fronts of the two countries. So basically, the idea that India is accusing Canada of giving safe havens to criminals and terror accused wanted in India. And Canada is saying that India has sent its government agents to carry out a killing in Canada. It essentially means this has now got into the domestic sphere. Already we've seen groups with hate speech, calling out Indian diplomats, calling out Indian officials. So the real worry would be, would those groups now target anyone of Indian origin? We've certainly seen targeting of Indian community centers, people of Indian origins worried in the past. But now it does go to that next level. However, the fact is that for Canada, Indian students represent a very large part of their student population. They've been welcomed there for decades, despite the fact that India-Canada ties have always had some issues. And it is hoped that remains, that in a sense, people-to-people ties are not affected by what is going on. My own concern is that, of course, people-to-people ties will be affected eventually. You will see a paring down of the relationship.
Well, the numbers are my team has just looked them up. It's 1.4 million ethnic Indians who live in Canada, and 300,000 students on last count. That's 319,000 students last year from India studying in universities in Canada. I do want to ask you this though. There is an advisory that's been put out by our Ministry of External Affairs asking Indian students specifically to exercise extreme caution. Would you explain to us what that means? I mean, what are they looking out for? What should they be careful about?
Well, certainly, travel advisories have different reasons. Some travel advisories are genuinely, there is a concern about violence in a particular region that has broken out. Don't go to this region. The Indian government's latest travel advisory about Canada refers really to areas around places like Brampton, around places in Surrey, in Canada, where we have seen heightened Khalistani separatist activities and activists over there. We've seen the biggest protests against India and the Indian government in those places. So I think that's essentially what they're referring to about being cautious. Means, watch your 360. Be careful, because there may be miscreants out there trying to target Indians. Some of it is also political, because a travel advisory is a way of saying that we don't consider this country as a friendly country. We don't consider our citizens are going to be, are going to be kept safe over there, or are going to be protected. And as a result, they're sending that signal as well. A travel advisory sometimes is also a diplomatic signal.
Well, I do want to ask you a few questions about all of the statements that have been made so far. If I may start with the first one, which is the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, making that statement on the floor of his parliament, accusing India or Indian agents of having a hand in the killing of this Khalistani separatist leader. Now, this is extremely unusual for any country to do, or to make an accusation as such outside of diplomatic channels. Could you explain to us historically, I mean, the way international relations normally function, why this is such an unusual thing to happen?
Yeah, as you said, Faye, it's certainly unprecedented. Firstly, countries normally have so many channels at their behest, that where they can send these messages out. You can go through government to government channels. You can go through the embassies in two countries. You can go through from leader to leader, or foreign minister to foreign minister, or at various different levels. You can send out a message, especially when it's countries like India and Canada. It's not a situation where you don't have officials speaking to each other. Instead of using any of those, what we see is Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who was in Delhi just a week before that, coming out in his parliament. And regardless of the words used, because the words used were, there are credible allegations that Canadian security agencies are pursuing. Regardless of the words used being slightly vague, he made it very clear that he believes that Indian government agents carried out the killing of Nijjar, somebody who is a wanted terrorist in India. He is on a number of lists for India, but is also a Canadian citizen. And making the point that this was not just something that was unacceptable from the point of view of diplomatic relations, but it was unacceptable in terms of Canada's own sovereignty, in terms of territorial integrity. These are very serious charges being made. And he spoke about the violation of international rule of law. Beyond that, he also said that he's in touch with all their partners and allies, essentially meaning what is called the Five Eyes intelligence agreement countries, which is US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And pronto after he made that statement, we had public statements coming from each of those countries saying the allegations are serious, please take them seriously, please cooperate, and let's hope this gets worked out. So he made a number of suggestions in that speech, which will have repercussions. India's reaction has been equally harsh, except that, of course, Prime Minister Modi himself has not responded to the allegations. But India's reactions have, you've been seeing them play out in terms of rejecting the allegations, in terms of putting out the travel advisory, in terms of visa suspensions. So no Canadians are going to get visas, Indian visas, for the foreseeable future, or at least temporarily. You've seen India calling for the downsizing of the Canadian High Commission, bring down the diplomats. India's also accused Canadian diplomats based in India of interfering in India's domestic affairs. So you've seen this escalate very quickly. And I think the reason it has escalated so quickly is because what Prime Minister Trudeau did was, in a sense, unprecedented. Now, Canadian officials will tell you, and I think there was the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations who said, we only took this step because India was not responding to Canadian security agencies going to India and saying, here's the evidence we have, please take action. Whether that's true or not, and the MEA has certainly said they have received no evidence so far. So there's a huge game being played out, in a sense, between the two countries now publicly, in diplomatic ties, particularly when the ties are not between two hostile nations. It's very rare to see this kind of public juxtaposition of the two stands.
Well, you did say that the Canadian, statements have said that they have approached India many times with the evidence. Now, this is evidence that has not been spoken of up till now, because the Five Eye allies that you've talked about, the US, the UK, and Australia, have supported an investigation, saying investigation should continue and we should have evidence. But Trudeau has not mentioned any evidence. He's not released any evidence. Even within his own country, the opposition is demanding evidence for the very serious accusation he has made, and set into motion a series of events that are unlikely to be very easy to put back in their place. So how likely is it that he will be forced to release evidence? Does he have the evidence? What is your personal opinion here?
Well, certainly, that is a big question. Where is the evidence? As you pointed out, Pierre Poilievre, who was told about the security agency's concerns just before Justin Trudeau went in and spoke in Parliament, has now said that evidence should be made public. Just to back it up, what is even stranger in a sense is that if the evidence points to an Indian hand in the killing, if that is still an investigation under process, and everyone is saying, please join the investigation, please ensure the investigation goes to its end, then why did Canada expel an Indian diplomat, a senior Indian diplomat? If it wasn't something that had already been confirmed and conclusively decided, why did China, I keep saying China, I mean Canada, why did Canada really take this position and expel an Indian diplomat? In return, India expelled a Canadian diplomat. So, you're looking at a huge amount of contradictions in what they're saying. If the evidence is conclusive, then why not show it? If the investigation is still going on and evidence is being collected, then why already take a decision like this?
Also, Ms. Haider, there's a very interesting announcement came in from India, in fact, the American embassies and high commissions, that President Joe Biden has been invited to be chief guest at the Indian Republic Day celebrations early next year. Now, one assumes that they wouldn't have announced this unless the backroom channels have already agreed to the visit. This is actually a power move by India to show that the Western allies might still favor India in this conversation as well?
Well, I think it cannot be a very premeditated move simply because the invitation to President Joe Biden was given by Prime Minister Modi during just before the G20 summit. So on, I think, the 8th of September. This was before he met with Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, before the first allegations were made about Nijjar, which were apparently in the Trudeau-Modi meeting. So the invitation had already gone out. The fact that the American ambassador chose to announce it yesterday, that can be analyzed as the Americans making it clear that, their ties are not being affected as of now. I think there is some amount of concern in India that other countries which are partners of India should not get involved in this particular debate, because this is an all-out diplomatic war between India and Canada. But Faye, and please do call me Suhasini. It's not just about the fact that this is happening between India and Canada and the subject of Khalistan, of safe havens to those who are wanted for crimes in India. Remember, India also has accused at various times the US, the UK, Australia as well. Not so far New Zealand, but New Zealand does have a sizable Indian diaspora as well, and has accused these countries of pandering to or not taking action against anti-India groups in their country, and particularly anti-India Khalistani separatist groups in their country. Remember, the Indian consulate in San Francisco has been attempted to be firebombed twice now. In the UK, you remember the controversy when someone was able to get to the front of the Indian High Commission and pull down the Indian flag. And India really reacted, pulled the security for the British High Commissioner in Delhi and all of that. With Australia, Prime Minister Modi has raised concerns about attacks on Hindu minorities in Australia by alleged Sikh Khalistani separatists in Australia. So that's one part of the problem, Faye. That it's not just about the fact that these countries are allied or partners of Canada. The second part is that these countries also seem to have these separatist elements that India has expressed concern about. And India has done it publicly. And I think eventually the third part is going to be that somewhere there, if India is going to take ownership of the diaspora community in terms of people who have been targeted, even if they are citizens of other countries, because of course India does not have dual nationality. So a lot of these people who are being targeted may be of Indian origin, and you gave that figure of 1.4 million, but they are not Indian citizens. So if India starts to talk about the safety of Indian community centers or Indian origin people's community centers and Indian origin foreign nationals, then somewhere along the line, people are going to say, well, Khalistani separatists are also originally of Indian origin. So both the alleged perpetrators and the victims are really then India's problem. So I think from many points of view, this is not an easy situation we've got into. The larger picture, of course, for the moment, is the India-Canada diplomatic row. And this is a diplomatic row between, say, the Prime Minister saying something here and Prime Minister saying something in his parliament and our Prime Minister, between the Ministry of External Affairs and Global Affairs Canada, between diplomats and the high commissions of the two countries. But there is, as I said, below it, a domestic issue, which makes it very different from other diplomatic rows.
We all know that the US gunned down Osama bin Laden on Pakistani soil. We've heard stories of how Mossad from Israel handles its problems against enemies of their state, even when they're on foreign soil. I understand diplomatically this is called an extra-territorial killing. Why is it that there seems to be a double standard when it comes to India, even in this hypothetical accusation that we're talking about?
You're absolutely right. And there's no question that there is a double standard here. Because the US has not only, sort of taken Osama bin Laden out and actually announced it to the world from Pakistan, the US has killed US citizens who they had suspected, for example, I think his name was Olaki in Yemen several years ago, and other countries too, as you pointed out. The Mossad most famously killed somebody it's suspected of terrorism in the UAE, in Dubai. So this does happen around the world. I don't think there's any way of explaining why the double standard, but I do think that perhaps the reason they are making the difference is because India and Canada are two democracies, that India and Canada share values, they have an Indo-Pacific strategy that involves each other, and that otherwise they have been friendly states. Now, I think there is a little bit of amnesia as well, Faye, because I think people forget that India and Canada did not have really high-level political contact for nearly 40 years. When Prime Minister Modi went to Canada in 2015, he was the first Indian Prime Minister to do a bilateral visit in Canada. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had gone for a multilateral one, but for a bilateral visit was the first Prime Minister Modi went since 1973, when former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had gone. There's a reason for that. The reason was that through the 1980s, when the Sikh separatist movement, the Khalistani separatist movement, really became very violent, and there were attacks across India. Indira Gandhi herself was assassinated, and through the 90s, and including events like the bombing of the Air India Kanishka flight from Canada to India. Throughout this period, India has made the consistent case that Canada is not taking its concerns seriously. Canada tried to put this off as, these are people who are fleeing persecution in India. And certainly there was a very, very big crackdown on the violence in Punjab, as you would well remember, and many sought refuge in Canada as a result of that. Now, that has been the default, in a sense, in relations until 2015, when it seemed that the government was willing to put aside the concerns over Khalistan, despite getting no assurances from the Canadian government, and start a new relationship, reset the relationship with Canada. And then we saw, an increase in the engagement between the two countries, strategic engagement between the two countries, Indo-Pacific strategy. Canada put out its Indo-Pacific strategy last year and called India a key ally. Trade relations improved. The talks over a free trade agreement, Canadian investment, I believe, in various funds, Canadian pension funds brought in as much as $20 billion. Bilateral trade, not very high right now, about $10 billion, but was expected to increase. So all of these things happen in this time. But at the end of the day, at the base of the tensions between the two countries remain this issue. And it was obviously not something that could be brushed aside, as we have seen in the last week.
So, Asni, the India-Canada trade is also massive. You did talk about the Canadian pension funds that invest heavily in India. We understand as of last year, bilateral trade between the two countries amounted to 13.7 billion Canadian dollars, or about 10 billion US dollars. Is there likely to be any sort of a hit onto trade? Is it likely that something like Canadian pension funds will actually roll back some of their money? And since India has now halted visas for all Canadian nationals, so India has not said that only student visas or only tourist visas, all visas have come to a grinding halt. Is Canada likely to reciprocate?
Well, I think all diplomatic action tends to become reciprocal, Faye. And you're absolutely right that so far trade was not affected. Actually, through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we did see that people to people ties continued. Trade continued in its own way. It
Because
is.
in popular culture, in popular memory, forgive me for interrupting you, most people won't know that through the 60s to about less than 10 years ago, that there was a diplomatic row that continued with Canada, because everybody saw Canada people to people as friendly. Everyone has an uncle who lives in Canada.
That's absolutely right. And it's a contrast to, say, a country like Pakistan, where everybody knows there were tensions and everybody knows that visas were difficult. There's no real student population between the two countries. There's no real travel or immigration between the two countries. So yes, that was one of the unique parts of the Indian-Canadian relationship. I do think it will be affected. Because once you start cutting down visas and then also cut down the number of diplomats in both countries, because everything will be reciprocal, what you're essentially saying is you're paring down ties between the two countries. The number of diplomats who will engage between the two countries goes down. We've seen the impact. Whether it has been, say, with Pakistan, or whether it has been with China, or whether it has been with countries like Turkey that India had tensions with for a while. What we see is that eventually trade gets hit. Eventually, people-to-people ties do get hit as well, and I think the rapid pace by which we have seen ties deteriorate between India and Canada just now seem to mean that unless somebody's going to step in and arrest the downslide, that other ties are going to be hit as well. After all, if you're going to say, I'm giving no visas to Canadians for a while, if that policy continues for, say, a week or 10 days, sooner or later, Canada is going to do a go slow on the number of Indians coming in. After which, it becomes a slippery slope and becomes very difficult to stop. Sorry, no, I just meant that there will be things like college admissions will begin, and then if people are not getting visas, I believe that even right now there are students who are who have got into colleges in Canada, who are applying for their visas, who are now a little worried if they are in India that they may not get that visa.
Yeah, and obviously there will be people with business in each other's countries who will need to travel for work, for trade, for university. Most importantly, there'll be students who have maybe come home on vacation, who need to go back, who are having their visas renewed and things like that. All of that as well. There might be questions. You did say domestic grandstanding. Would you be able to explain to us also Canadian domestic politics at this point, where Justin Trudeau stands in his own arena, and how much of that might be influencing what we're seeing him do at this point?
Well, I certainly think that Justin Trudeau is doing some of this as grandstanding to his own constituency, also to his own polity. Because at the end of the day, it is clear that every party in Canada has taken a sympathetic stand, and because I say 1980s is when we saw the chill really begin. Justin Trudeau's own father, Pierre Trudeau, was the prime minister in Canada from 1980 to 1984. After that, we saw many leaders, Chrétien, all the rest, come from different political parties and become leaders of Canada. But we didn't see India's concerns over Khalistan being really assuaged or being addressed. It seems to be that there is some sympathy across the board. If you were to go to, the Canadian Parliament's website and see the actual transcript of that parliamentary speech that Trudeau made, it was followed by speeches by Jagmeet Singh, by I think he's the new Democratic Party by Pierre Poilievre, who's the Labour sort of rival to Trudeau. All of them making the point that they are locked in arms with the government on this issue of national security, of national sovereignty. None of them seemed to suggest for a minute that India had valid concerns. They were all making the point that we have to be tough with India. Yes, some of them have now targeted Trudeau as well. Now, at a point when Trudeau is facing lower numbers in terms of popularity, in terms of approval, there's economic issues in Canada. Certainly, this seems like an issue where he could take a very strong stand. But, Faye, I don't want to trivialize this as just politics. Eventually, there will be grandstanding. There will be grandstanding not just in Canada, in India as well. We've seen the opposition and the government really come together on this issue as well, and making it all about sovereignty and India's threat perceptions. The question is really a sort of broader one, because we're not just talking about one moment in time. It's not just Trudeau, who's come from a particularly bruising visit to India, embarrassed over here after everything. He had an acrimonious meeting with Prime Minister Modi. He was obviously, was not happy. He bunked the G20 banquet thrown by President Murmu. The obvious public images of the two leaders were very awkward. He was asked about the awkwardness, actually, at the press conference. He was asked why he bunked the banquet, and he said scheduling issues. He finishes this visit, or so he thinks, and is about to leave when he finds out that his plane cannot take off. And he cools his heels in Delhi for another 36 hours. I presume he spent some of that time in his hotel room watching television, and Indian television has been ruthless with him. There's another story out that suggests that the Canadian security felt that the presidential suite that was booked for him had security issues. I presume they thought there was some surveillance over there. And so he moved to a normal suite. So there was a lot going on in this visit, which wouldn't have left happy memories for Justin Trudeau at all. But I would not want to just bring this down to, what one prime minister, one leader said at one point of time. There is a very broad issue over here, one of concern. At the end of the day, Nijjar, who has been killed, was to have been brought to India and tried for a number of cases. The fact that someone who's wanted on India's list is a Canadian citizen and was able to operate over there without facing the Canadian authorities, questioning him, wondering whether they should extradite him, is a significant worry. And I think are those broader concerns that have now come back. Has India's reaction been, sort of over the top in terms of reacting to what Trudeau said? Perhaps some would say that, the way to go about this now is to find out what is the evidence, to put that out publicly, to be transparent about it. Because half the problem is neither side actually told anyone that Nijjar was on the agenda when Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Trudeau met. Maybe that would have been one way of going about it. But instead, the Indian government has decided that it is very offended by the allegations that have been made. In terms of whether the Indian government is involved in any kind of activity in Canada, as the Canadians have been alleging, that's part of it altogether. Here we are talking about a very specific case of the killing of somebody. And there the facts should be allowed to speak for themselves without all this diplomatic grandstanding.
All right, so Suhasini Haider, thank you so much for giving me this time and breaking this down for us. Hopefully, on one hand, like you did say, of course, hopefully this doesn't trickle down to people relations, that for people of Indian origin, for Indian students, for NRIs and diaspora, Canada continues to be a safe and wholesome place for them to live. And this problem remains on the diplomatic end of things, but it does seem to be escalating really, really quickly. As of this evening, visas to all Canadian citizens have been suspended by India. The team at the High Commission has been asked to downsize, and now as the night progresses, I suppose we'll find out how Canada responds, to this in their time zone. So Hasni Haider, thank you so much for speaking with me and helping us break all of this down for our audience.
Thank you.
For our audience, remember, for more news and updates, download the Beetroot News app, where we put out all of our information and news and updates. Our aim is to provide you with news that is unemotional, with no hyperbole and no opinion. It's just the news so that you can understand it in the best way possible. Do tell your friends and family to download the Beetroot News app as well. Thank you so much for tuning in. For more news and updates, download the Beetroot News app from the App Store and the Play Store.